Let's start with Afghanistan. You say it's an unfolding humanitarian disaster. The aid is urgently needed. But I suppose there will be people watching this who will say, why should we be giving money to a country controlled by a murderous regime that's rolling back human rights, especially for women, hard won, including by the sacrifice of our own troops?
This is a humanitarian catastrophe. I don't forget the sacrifice of our troops, and part of the reason we were there was to protect the Afghan people. And now we face a nightmare. We face a catastrophe. It's really a moral failure, because when children are starving and when families are emaciated and when there is no health provision, and despite polio, cholera and COVID, I think we've got a duty to act. Now, there are self-interested reasons for acting. We want to prevent terrorists gaining the upper hand again and exporting their terrorism to the West. We want to prevent heroin getting to the streets of Britain. We also want to prevent mass migration, and already 3 million have left Afghanistan. But as Rowan Williams and I said in an article yesterday, there is also a duty to help children in particular and families with this immediate threat of starvation itself. And this is a matter of days, not weeks and months. If we cannot get aid to people, they will die in front of our eyes. And we've already seen TV pictures of children so emaciated that they will not survive. So it's humanitarian. And I don't think anybody, any father, any mother in the world would say that when children are in this difficulty, we should fail to act. What we've got to do is find a way around this that does not legitimize the regime, that gives them no credibility for the aid that we're giving, gets the money through the NGOs and through the United Nations organizations, and make sure it's absolutely clear that the help is being provided by people who have wanted to help the people of Afghanistan over the last 20 years.
I'm sure a powerful case can be made morally for this, but you yourself have just raised the point when you talked about getting the money to NGOs. How can we be sure that that money is going to get to the places where it's needed and where people can be fed and sheltered and kept safe over winter?
Well, I'm already chairman of the Education Cannot Wait organisation that helps refugees and displaced people. And you are able, and UNICEF is being able to do this, to make informal arrangements at a local level where you can pay the salaries of teachers and health workers, and at the same time make sure girls can go to school and make sure that people are actually fed. So there are ways at the moment. Martin Griffiths, the humanitarian coordinator for the United Nations, is showing that through the United Nations, the World Bank, and through many NGOs, we can actually get aid to people. The problem is that there is an appeal now for $4.5 billion. That's urgently needed for the 23 million people that you talked about to prevent them starving, and only a quarter of that money has been raised. Now, there were 40 countries in the coalition in Afghanistan. What I'm suggesting, and there is a petition now circulating through Save the Children asking the British public to support this, what I'm suggesting is that Britain and the European Union call a humanitarian conference, bring the 40 countries together, get the money in, make sure it's actually going to the starving children and to the families in need. But all that can be done, but the money has not been raised. And one of the reasons I'm making this appeal this morning with the churches and faith groups who've signed a letter also is that I believe the British public can ask the government to pay attention to this, call the conference, get this done. And of course, there are talks starting with the Taliban in Norway today. And first on the agenda will be this issue of humanitarian aid getting through without giving credibility to the regime itself.
You, of course, are able to make this appeal because you've been for many years amongst world leaders, and you've been at all of the conferences and talks and so on and so forth. The big issue that would occupy those conversations today, of course, is Ukraine. Do you actually think anything is going to come from the talks with Vladimir Putin about Ukraine?
Well, let me say, first of all, the same principle applies to Afghanistan as Ukraine. You do need leadership. You need people to act together. You do need unity. And one of the problems in Afghanistan is we need a country to lead this humanitarian effort and to call the conference. I think the same applies in Ukraine. President Putin will exploit any weakness, any failure to show strength, and in particular, any failure to show unity. will give a blank check, if you like, to continued aggression. Now, we know that the demands he's making are completely unreasonable. He wants to remove weapons from members of NATO's soils. He wants to prevent Sweden and Finland ever joining NATO. He wants the NATO countries to say that they will not enlist any countries in the future. Now, he's making unreasonable demands. And of course, the only way to deal with that, because if you accede to one, you'll simply get another set of demands on top of them, is to show strength. And that's why I think what Emily Thornby said this morning is really important, that you've got to have a united West and a united set of allies. And of course, that is something that is in question this weekend. And again, I think Britain, America and the Western allies have got to come together and show that they are completely agreed on the need for sanctions, that they will be financial, they'll be economic, they'll be targeted on individual people. We will not hesitate to apply them quickly. And I think that message has got to go out without any danger that there is not unanimity.
Paul Volcker, the senior American diplomat, who I'm pretty sure you will know, said last week that that programme that you've just outlined would be the right thing to do. But even so, he did not think that it would prevent a Russian invasion, because if that's what Mr. Putin wants to do, that's what he wants to do, it's what he will do, and nothing we can do can stop him.
Well, you know, we know that President Putin wants to declare a sphere of influence that extends way beyond the borders of Russia itself. We know he would prefer to have a different government in Ukraine, one that is in his own hands, although I'm not sure about all this information this morning about the particular names. They don't seem to add up. But the important thing is that I've met him on a number of occasions. I've dealt with him. I've had to stand up to him when we had the assassination on British soil. But he's an opportunist. He probably does not himself know what he's going to do next. We know what he wants to do. The question is what he will do. The important thing is, at this particular point in time, and there's going to be discussions, the Defense Secretary is going to Moscow, there's letters exchanged between America and the Russians. At this point, we've got to show strength. And that's, I think, what was something of an issue in the last few days, when it wasn't clear what the Germans were doing. The French were talking about a separate, or appeared to be talking about a separate deal that was a European deal with Russia. And of course, there is this issue about energy prices and what is actually going to happen if the flow of gas continues to slow to the west. All these issues are going to be taken into account, but the important thing is you've got to have a show of strength.
You said you weren't that sure about the intelligence which has been published today. Do you think the Foreign Office has... I mean, this is very unusual for the Foreign Office to publish this kind of intelligence. Do you think they've overstepped the mark here?
Well, I've no doubt that President Putin would prefer to establish a friend of his, as he had before, in control in Ukraine. And I've no doubt that he has possible people in mind if he was ever to be in this position. But the names that have been given don't necessarily seem to add up. But that's not the real issue. The real issue is, can you get the allies together? Can NATO show its power and its strength as a unified force? And can we force the Russians to back down? And I think, you know, from my knowledge of President Putin, he's an adventurist as well as an opportunist. But you must not give him an inch if you're going to stand up to Russian aggression.
OK, but by my reckoning, Gordon Brown, I don't think there's anybody who has been in Downing Street alive longer than you have as Chancellor and then Prime Minister. What do you make of the chaos that is engulfing Downing Street right now? And can you imagine the kind of thing that we are reading about taking place on your watch?
Well, this is indeed about standards in public life. Look, we know the government is immobilised, and despite what Dominic Raab says, the attention that is needed for the cost of living crisis, for the schools, for people to catch up as children in schools, for obviously Afghanistan, for Ukraine, for all the problems that are besetting the health service, the attention has veered towards dealing with these particular scandals. And my fear is that scandal is going to follow Boris Johnson as long as he's Prime Minister. You know, we don't just have the scandal, and all the details will probably come out later this week about partying. We have the conflicts of interest, we have the dubious appointments, we have foreign money and question marks over that, who's paying the bills for what, and I don't think we're going to see this administration end in anything other than scandal.
Are you saying to me that you think, looking at the current Prime Minister, that this is not a man with either the character or the moral stature to occupy the position of Prime Minister of this country?
I think it's about standards in public life. I'm not going to comment on Boris Johnson as an individual, but it is about standards in public life. And the minute the public realise that governments are asking their citizens to follow rules that they're not prepared to follow themselves, and the minute you have a question mark over behaviour and conduct in public life, that is indeed very serious, because when you're dealing with a pandemic and now with an economic cost of living crisis, the most important thing you need is that people are prepared to trust their leaders to get things right, and trust them to do things even when they're unpopular to get the right answers in the long run. So this is really an ethical issue. It's about the conduct of public life.
Having said that, the phrase that is going around this week is fish rots from the head. Very many people have said, this is not for me to make a judgment, many people have said that this kind of thing would never have happened with Theresa May, David Cameron, Tony Blair, or Gordon Brown in number 10, because you set an example. Do you think that it is time for Mr. Johnson, if that is true, to go and to have someone who will set the right standards and the right kind of leadership, both of which you've mentioned this morning?
Well, Trevor, you know, I came on to talk about Afghanistan and about humanitarian crisis, and I feel that Boris Johnson should be dealing with this. And I don't want to make this simply about a person. I think it's the character of the government that is at issue. It's the standards in public life. And if I were him, I would be sure to say that we're going to have a massive review of all rules governing public life in this country, because clearly you cannot run Downing Street the way it's been run, you cannot make appointments in the way they've been made, and you cannot allow the sort of behaviour that has happened, and hope somehow the public will not notice when you're asking them to take decisions that you're not prepared to take themselves. Look, Sue Gray is going to report on the present issues.
All right, you're quite right to say let's focus on the things that matter. And before I let you go, can I just ask you one specific thing which probably you would know about better than anybody else in the world? You were the last person to hike national insurance. Do you think that the Chancellor should go ahead with that, or should it be delayed, as many people are suggesting?
Well, I'm not convinced that national insurance is the right tax to deal with the problems that we're facing, social care in particular. And I think Keir Starmer is right. You've got to look at people's standards of living as a whole and what costs they're going to have to bear. Look, I'm a patron of a charity in Fife, and we're dealing with poverty that I have not seen in my lifetime. We're dealing with people who can't heat their homes. We're dealing with children who are not going to school well-clad and going to school hungry. And we're dealing with a crisis amongst so many people because they are demoralised and facing mental health problems as a result of what has happened as a result of this crisis. Now, to impose upon those families an energy price rise in their heating bills and in their electricity, then to impose a tax rise for those who are paying national insurance at a time when food prices are also rising at the same time, and you've had this £20 cut in people's universal credit, it is simply not acceptable, and the devastating effect on poverty will be seen very quickly if all these things go ahead. So Keir Starmer has been right to say we've got to focus on what the living standards are of people at the moment and how they're going to be cut if we don't act.